This is a reading of the book Simple Messages on Romans by Harold S. Martin. We are now in chapter 5, the sanctification of believers, and we are in point 3, the preventive of holiness. Our text shall cover Romans chapter 7, verses 7 to 23. Let us read. We all remember the day we accepted Christ and were baptized into His body. The only thing that seemed to matter on that glad day was that the Lord had forgiven our sins and that we were justified by His grace. But as the days rolled around and the weeks passed by, we soon noticed that the evil nature within us continued to assert itself. Every believer is conscious of the fact that there is a warfare going on within his being, and that the forces of good and evil are contending fiercely for the mastery of his soul. This activity of sin and self within us is a preventive or a hindrance to holiness. No matter how hard we try to keep on the alert and reckon ourselves dead unto sin, we still find it a struggle. The last half of Romans chapter 7 deals with the inner conflict that comes to every child of God. The struggle against sin and evil does not come to an end when one becomes a Christian. In fact, the conflict intensifies. For one thing, a converted person is much more sensitive to sin than the unconverted man is. Before conversion, we thought that beating the boss company out of its fare was a clever thing, and that dressing in the latest styles was a smart thing, and that the accumulation of wealth was a sign of success. But now, our consciences don't permit this kind of thinking, and so the conflict between good and evil becomes all the greater. In the closing paragraphs of Romans chapter 7, Paul draws aside the veil and permits us to look into his own inner life and to witness the struggle there. In Romans chapter 7, verses 14 and 15, he says that he knew what was right and wanted to do what was right, and yet somehow he didn't always do it. He also knew what was wrong, and the last thing he wanted to do was to do what was wrong, yet somehow he did it. Some ask, but did this conflict Paul describes occur before or after he was converted? It seems Paul was describing the conflict within his life after his salvation, although this is probably a description of the early years of his Christian experience. This was just one period in the experience of Paul's spiritual development. He says in verse 22, "I delight in the law of God after the inward man." Paul delighted in God's law. Surely, this is the language of a converted person. The unconverted man doesn't delight in God's law. Rather, he is an enemy of God and is alienated from God. The fact that Paul experienced an inner conflict after his conversion is altogether in keeping with the Bible teaching that the two natures are in constant conflict. Galatians chapter 5 verse 17 says, "For the flesh lusts against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh, and these are contrary the one to the other." Before his conversion, Paul seemed to have no difficulties with observing the law. He says in Philippians chapter 3 verse 6 that concerning the righteousness which is in the law, he was blameless. Before his conversion, the conflict was not very strong, but the more he grew in faith and knowledge, the more sinful he realized himself to be. The more sincere a Christian is, the more faithfully he tries to please God, the more conscious he is of this struggle within. In fact, the very presence of a struggle in one's life is often evidence of regeneration. Romans chapter 7 comes to an end with a cry for deliverance. It describes a man who is trying to be good by his own efforts, but every time he is beaten back by the power of indwelling sin. The law can't deliver. Verse 7 says that it points out sin, but it has no power to produce holiness. Mere human willpower can't deliver either. Verse 18 says, "For I know that in me dwells no good thing, for to will is present with me, but how to perform that which is good I find not." As long as the Christian trusts his own powers and seeks to keep the law of God in his own strength, he is going to be defeated. And that brings us to the first verses of chapter 8. We will stop here and we'll continue next week. We're doing this in connection with our series Bible study on the book of Romans, which we're going to conduct tomorrow online. I'll see you tomorrow. God bless everyone.